Welcome to the Occupational Safety Leadership Podcast, episode number 249. In today's episode, we're going to talk about performing gap assessments. So basically, in a gap assessment, you have, well, much like the word says, you have assessed that you have a gap in your programs, and like all things, you can have a large gap, you can have a small gap. You may find that you're doing a pretty good job, but now that you're have more experience, have more things, you see where you can do a better job at something. Um, let's say, for the sake of argument, that we're going to talk about HASCOM. Maybe you've done a great job of doing a HASCOM program, and you wrote up everything, and you made people have training. But then you determined that um, somehow a chemical has gotten onto the facility, has not been approved, you don't have an SDS for it, and all that stuff. It used to be very common that people would offer free samples, and of course, when people hear free, well, they want to get free, of course. So now that you've seen the gap, you now say, oh, I now have to close that gap out there then. So one of the difficult things when you're doing this, of course, is that once there's a gap that's easy to assess, it's very easy to close. One of the hard parts in doing a gap assessment is how are you going to frame success, right? And in this case, we'll say that success is, for the sake of argument, a chemical is approved. We have the SDS, we have the training, and of course, along with that, the PPE, the storage, and all that good stuff then. So now we're going to say, okay, everything's good, you know. So now we framed success, you know. So uh, you'll see as time goes on and you gain more experience. Sometimes you do have to go back and update what you were doing previously. So sometimes a gap assessment has a little bit to do with work, but not to do with work. Potentially, you want to, let's say in this next example, you want to do professional development and you're doing great in all the areas that you've been assigned. And then you start thinking, well, at some point, I want a promotion. How do I get to that next level? Do I need to do additional study? Do I need to take on additional assignments? Do I have to do presentations and brown bags, and all that kind of stuff? And so now we now have a gap. Part of this gap is how do I go back and close this gap? And of course, I'm talking in this case about some pretty easy gaps to go back and close, But let's say for this next one that you want to get a promotion, and part of the promotion is you're going to give couple of presentations. You know, maybe you think you're not going to do a good job at this presentation. You know, so one of the things about getting better as we go on is you can sit down, you can read about stuff, you can look at the tools and techniques and look at what others have done, and that's awesome and great. That's a starting point. That helps you to go back and get better, but you still haven't stood up in front of somebody. You still got to give that presentation then. So so understanding like framing that success. Part of it, of course, is do you get up and give that presentation? And are you prepared? Can you take on additional questions? Is there let's say that you have a employee, not that I ever have, but sometimes employees like to wait for a nice gathering, and then they'll start throwing zingers at you. Then. So you gotta keep a cool head. And of course, like all things, if you don't know, you say I don't know that answer, but I'll go find that answer for you. And then of course you have to actually find that answer, actually follow up, and actually make sure that people know that you've now closed this loop. You know. So if there's something that you can't answer, well, that's going to be a gap. That's right there. So now we're going to go back and close that gap. So sometimes as you're hired into a new role, one of the big things is to go back and perform this gap assessment then. Because you'd like to think that as you're coming into a new role, um, everything's awesome and it's great, and the previous person just left because they retired from a joyous life, and it's everything's roses, rainbows, unicorns, but maybe you get in and it's just not a good system. And sometimes it's not that it's not a good system, but there's gaps in there. A lot of times we become very comfortable with what we're doing. So at times it's kind of hard to say, well, how do I get better out there? So that's it for today's episode. I think at this point I'm just rambling on, but the big thing is you have a gap out there. You go back and fill that gap. When you do these gap assessments, you may sit down and say, um, I have 5 things that I have to work on there. There's a lot of different techniques out there. Do you work like a little bit at all 5, or do you say, I only work at this one, and then I'm going to work at the next one? So there's going to be pros and cons, to both ways of tackling this gap then. So, and one of the things that I really try and stress is that when you find a gap, close that gap. Your sister plants may have exactly that same gap out there too, because sometimes it's a cultural thing that goes between the different locations. Share what you find, share your findings, share how you solved it with other facilities as well. With that, let's call it a day. Episode number 249 is complete. Thank you for joining me. My name is Dr. David Ayers. Have a safe day.